I never imagined that chasing my dreams would destroy everything I believed in. The offer came one morning in the form of an email from a company in Uruguay, a leadership role with high pay, incredible benefits, and a chance to do something meaningful. I stared at my screen for a long time, thinking about how far away Uruguay was from my home from Andrew. He walked in with a mug of coffee and saw my face. "What is it?" he asked, and I showed him the email. He smiled and hugged me, but I could feel the tension in his arms. 5 months, he said softly. That is a long time. Yes, I replied, but it is a once-in-a-lifetime chance. We talked late into the night that day, making plans, discussing time differences, promising to stay in touch every day. Andrew said he would be fine. We hugged so tightly the night before my flight. It felt like we were saying goodbye for years, not months. The morning I left, our neighbor Jessica came by. She brought a small gift and offered to drive me to the airport with Andrew. I hesitated, but Andrew nodded. "Go ahead, she is just being nice." I sat in the back seat of her car with my luggage on my lap while she drove, and Andrew sat beside her. She kept glancing at him in the mirror, smiling a little too much. I brushed it off. Maybe she was just being friendly, or maybe I did not want to see what was already there. At the airport, Andrew hugged me tightly and whispered, "Be safe. I love you." "I love you too," I said with a lump in my throat. As the plane took off, I looked out the window, wondering how 5 months would change us. My new life in Uruguay was fast-paced and exhausting. Every morning, I woke up to meetings, deadlines, and new faces. But no matter how busy I was, I never forgot Andrew. I called him every night without fail, even if it was just to hear his voice. At first, he picked up every time. He asked about my day, told me about his, and made me laugh when I felt homesick. But slowly things changed. He stopped picking up sometimes, said he was busy or asleep. I told myself not to worry. We were both adults. We could handle this. Then Jessica started showing up in our calls, just in the background, sometimes bringing Andrew a drink, or laughing at something he said. I found it strange. She always seemed to be around. Once she even answered his phone, saying he was in the shower. I asked what she was doing there. She said she was just checking on him, making sure he ate something. Again, I brushed it off. Maybe I was being paranoid. I had bigger things to focus on. Still, something in my chest twisted every time I saw her face. Something felt wrong. I started sending Andrew care packages, letters, snacks, his favorite books. He said thank you, but never sounded excited. The distance was becoming more than just physical. I missed the way he used to laugh with me, talk with me, touch me. But I convinced myself we would be fine once I got home. We just needed to hold on. 5 months would go by quickly. I circled the return date on my calendar with red ink. I planned to surprise him. He had no idea I was coming back early. I wanted to see the joy on his face when he saw me. Little did I know the surprise would be mine, and it would shatter me in ways I could never imagine. The plane landed just after sunrise. The sky was painted in soft gold and orange, as if the universe was welcoming me home. I held my breath with excitement. This was the moment I had imagined for weeks. I had told no one I was coming back early, not even Andrew. It was supposed to be a surprise. The perfect reunion. I imagined knocking on the door and him opening it in shock and happiness. He would lift me up, twirl me around, tell me how much he missed me. I would hand him the watch I bought for him, and we would kiss under the sunlight. I took a cab from the airport directly to our home. My heart raced as the familiar streets passed by the windows. The driver asked if I was okay, because I could not stop smiling. I told him I was going home to my husband after 5 long months. He smiled and said he hoped my reunion would be beautiful. I tipped him extra when we arrived and stepped out of the cab. With my suitcase in one hand and the gift box in the other, I walked slowly to the front door. Everything looked the same. The garden, the welcome mat, even the little gnome statue. Andrew hated but never removed, because I liked it. I reached into my purse and pulled out my house key. I turned it gently, and the door creaked open. I stepped inside and was immediately hit by the familiar scent of home. But something was different. There were clothes on the floor, 2 wine glasses on the table. A faint laugh echoed from down the hallway. I froze. I heard voices, and then I heard the sounds that every wife dreads. Moans, laughter, the creak of our bed. My heart stopped. I set down my suitcase and walked slowly down the hallway. Each step felt like walking into a nightmare. I pushed open the bedroom door, and there they were, Andrew and Jessica, my husband, and our neighbor, entwined together in our bed. My bed, the sheets I had folded 5 months ago, the pillows we picked out together. His hands were on her the same way they used to be on me, their eyes wide when they saw me standing there. Jessica screamed and pulled the blanket over herself. Andrew jumped up and tried to say something. "Jane," he stammered. "I can explain." But I did not need any explanation. Everything was clear. 5 months of lies. 5 months of betrayal. I felt like the ground beneath me disappeared. I let out a scream so loud, it felt like it came from my soul. The gift box fell from my hand and crashed to the floor, the watch, inside breaking into pieces. "Is this what you do when your wife works for our future?" I shouted, my voice trembling with rage. Jessica grabbed her clothes and bolted past me without saying a word. Andrew reached out to me, but I stepped back. "Do not touch me," I hissed. "You are nothing to me now." I turned around and walked out of that room, out of that house, out of that life. I did not look back. I walked until my legs gave out. I collapsed on a bench at a gas station and cried until my throat burned. Everything I had built had crumbled in a single moment. The man I loved, the life I cherished, all gone. But deep inside, a small voice whispered, "You are not broken. Not yet. This is not the end." I spent the night at a cheap motel near the edge of town. The room smelled like dust and old cigarettes. But it was quiet, and that was all I needed. I stared at the ceiling for hours, trying to make sense of what just happened. How could Andrew do this to me? How could Jessica look me in the eyes for months and still crawl into my bed behind my back? I replayed everything. Every video call where Andrew looked distracted. Every moment Jessica smiled too wide when she mentioned him. All the signs I ignored. I blamed myself for being too trusting, too naive. But no, the fault was theirs. They made choices. They lied. They betrayed. And now they would live with the consequences. The next morning I turned off my phone. I did not want to see his messages or hear his voice. I knew what he would say. He would say it was a mistake. He would say he missed me. He would cry and beg and promise it meant nothing. But I had seen it. And once you see something like that, you cannot unsee it. I took a bus downtown and rented a small apartment with the money I had saved from Uruguay. It was nothing special, but it was mine. It had empty walls and a squeaky bed and a window that faced a brick wall. But it was mine. No lies. No betrayal. Just silence. I applied for jobs the same day. Something to keep me occupied. Something to rebuild from. I did not tell anyone where I was, not even my family. I needed space. I needed time. I cried sometimes, at night mostly, when the world was quiet and I was alone with my thoughts. But in the daylight I stood tall. I cooked for myself. I read books. I went on walks. And every step I took away from Andrew felt like healing. One evening, I passed by a bridal shop and saw a woman trying on a gown. She looked so happy, so full of hope, and I felt something crack inside me because I remembered that feeling, the belief that love was enough, that marriage was sacred, that promises were real. I turned away and kept walking. Faster. I did not want to cry in public again. As I walked, I realized something. I was still young, still strong, still capable of building a life, maybe even a better one. Without him, without the lies, Without the weight of betrayal pressing on my chest every mornings, I went home that night and wrote in a journal. I wrote everything I felt, all the anger, all the grief, and then I wrote this: I will not let what they did break me. I will rise from this, not for revenge, but for peace, because I deserve better, because I am worth more, and because they will never find happiness built on the pain of someone they destroyed. That night I slept for the first time in days, and when I woke up, the sun looked a little warmer, the world a little brighter. Weeks passed, and the silence from Andrew slowly turned into noise. First it was texts begging for forgiveness, then missed calls at all hours of the night, then voicemails, long ones filled with apologies, tears, promises. I never listened to them. I deleted them as soon as they arrived. I had nothing left to hear. One day he showed up at my apartment. I watched him from behind the curtain standing outside, like a ghost from a life I no longer belonged to. He looked tired. His hair was messy, his eyes sunken. I did not open the door. I just waited until he walked away. It took him 30 minutes. 30 minutes of standing alone, waiting, hoping. But hope had no place here anymore. I heard from a friend a few days later that Jessica had left him. Apparently their little fantasy collapsed fast. She thought he would leave me for her, which he did. But she never expected to be left with the broken version of him. A man without a job. A man whose neighbors whispered when he walked by. A man who used to be a husband and now was just a mistake. He tried to contact my family, but they respected my space. They told him I needed time. Truth was I needed distance, not time. Distance from lies, from betrayal, from the version of me that once believed love could survive anything. I found work at a local clinic, helping people cope with trauma and mental stress. It was strange at first, sitting across from patients while carrying so much of my own pain. But something about helping others started to heal me. Their strength reminded me of my own. Their stories helped me find meaning in mine. Each day, I walked to work past the same coffee shop. And one morning I stopped inside, ordered my drink, sat by the window, and opened a book. For the first time in months, I felt peaceful. Not happy, not yet, but peaceful, like I could breathe again. One evening, while folding laundry, I found one of Andrew's old shirts. I held it for a second, then walked straight to the trash and dropped it in. It was a small act, but it felt like cutting a rope that had been dragging behind me. Another day, I found the broken pieces of the watch I had meant to give him, still inside the box, hidden under my bed. I took it out, brought it to the park, and threw it into the river. The splash it made was soft, almost unnoticed. But inside me, something roared. Letting go, releasing. I began writing again. Journals, poems, letters to no one. Words poured from me like rain after drought. I wrote not to remember, but to forget. Not to hold on, but to let go. And with each word I felt stronger. He was no longer my beginning or my end. He was just a chapter, one that hurt, one that changed me, but not one that defined me. And every day I stepped further away from that chapter and closer to who I was meant to be. The seasons changed, and with them so did I. I started going to the gym every morning before work. At first, it was just to feel something again. But then it became a habit, a rhythm that made me feel powerful. Each drop of sweat felt like I was washing away a piece of the pain. I bought new clothes, cut my hair shorter, looked in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because she was different, but because she looked alive, not broken, not weak, just strong and certain. People at work began to notice. They said I looked lighter, like something inside me had shifted. I smiled and nodded, but kept the truth to myself. I had been shattered, but I chose to rebuild, not as I was, but as I wanted to be. One afternoon, while I was walking home with groceries, I saw Andrew across the street. He looked thinner, his shirt wrinkled, his shoulders low. He saw me too, and for a moment, everything froze. He raised his hand as if to wave, but I just turned and walked away. There was nothing left to say. Later that night, he sent me one last message, a long one, telling me he lost his job, that Jessica left him after 2 months, that he was in debt, that the house was going into foreclosure. He said he missed me, that I was the best thing that ever happened to him, that he had made a mistake. I stared at the message for a long time, then deleted it without replying. He had made his choices. He had picked lust over loyalty. He had chosen to destroy our home. Now he had to live in the ruins. I would not return to save him. I was not his rescue. I was not his second chance. I was my own salvation, and I was doing just fine without him. The nights grew quieter, the dreams less haunted. I found joy in small things, the warmth of my blanket after a long day, the sound of rain on the window, the taste of good coffee in the morning. I smiled more often, not forced smiles, but real ones that came from somewhere deep inside, the kind I had not felt since long before Uruguay, the kind I thought I lost forever. I started planning trips again, not for work, for myself. I booked a weekend getaway by the coast, packed light, and left my phone behind. As I stood by the ocean that evening, watching the waves crash against the rocks, I felt something I could not explain. Not happiness, not peace, but freedom, real freedom. I had survived the storm. I had endured the heartbreak, and I had found myself again on the other side. This was not the life I planned, but it was the one I chose, and it was mine, fully mine. Months passed, and I stopped counting the days since everything fell apart. I no longer marked anniversaries, no longer woke up with that hollow feeling in my chest. I was simply living, breathing, being, and that was more than enough. One morning, I walked into my usual coffee shop, and the barista smiled at me the way people do when they notice something changing in you. "You look different," he said in a kind voice. "Better, lighter." I smiled back and said, "Thank you," without explaining. There was no need. I knew what he saw. I had reclaimed my life. Piece by piece, I had taken back what was mine. My peace, my worth, my direction. Andrew had become nothing more than a memory, sometimes a shadow that crossed my mind in quiet moments, but never a storm anymore. I heard through friends that he had moved out of town. His debts had piled up, and the house had finally been taken by the bank. He bounced between jobs, nothing stable. Jessica never came back, and from what I heard, she had moved on quickly. It made me feel nothing. No bitterness, no satisfaction, just emptiness. They had chosen each other and lost everything. I had chosen myself and found more than I ever expected. One evening, I walked by a street musician playing a soft tune that reminded me of simpler times. I sat on a nearby bench and let the music wash over me. I thought about how far I had come, how I had cried on a bench months ago, broken and lost. And now I sat here whole and strong. Life has a strange way of restoring balance. Not always fast, not always loud, but surely, patiently. That same week, I received an invitation to speak at a conference, a mental health event for women who had experienced emotional betrayal. They asked me to share my story. At first, I hesitated. Did I really want to open that wound again? Did I want strangers to know the darkest chapter of my life? But then I thought about the women still in that pain, still hiding their tears, still questioning their worth. And I said yes. That night I wrote my speech in one sitting. I told the truth, every part of it, not to shame Andrew or Jessica, but to show that healing was possible, that survival was beautiful. The night of the event, I stood in front of a full room, my voice steady, my heart calm, and I told them everything. When I finished, the room was silent. Then came the applause, long, warm, heartfelt. Women came up to me crying, thanking me, telling me they finally felt seen. And in their eyes, I saw my own reflection. Not the version of me that was betrayed, but the version that rose, the one who walked away, the one who chose herself. And in that moment, I knew my pain had become my purpose, and there was no greater revenge than that. After the conference, my life began to move in a direction I never expected. People started reaching out, asking me to speak at more events, to write for magazines, to be a voice for women who had been silenced by betrayal. I accepted each opportunity with an open heart, not because I needed attention, but because I wanted my pain to mean something more than just a sad chapter. I wanted it to plant seeds for others to grow. With each story I shed another layer of the past. It no longer haunted me. It empowered me. I published an article called "The Day I Came Home to a Stranger." It went viral. Thousands of messages flooded in. Women, men, people of all ages, thanking me for putting into words what they had never been able to express. I felt like I had stepped into the light after living in the dark for too long. One afternoon, while sipping tea by my window, I received a handwritten letter. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity won. It was from Andrew. No return address, just his messy handwriting on the envelope. Inside the letter, he poured out everything. How he regretted it, how he could not sleep, how he lost everything, how Jessica left him for someone richer and younger, how he now worked long hours bagging groceries just to pay off credit card debt. He said he thought about me every day, that he still loved me, that he would always love me. He ended the letter with a simple sentence: "I understand if you never want to see me again." I folded the letter once and set it on fire in the sink, not out of hatred, but because I no longer needed closure. I already had it. It had come from within. I watched the paper curl into ash and smiled to myself. I whispered goodbye and meant it. That night I went out to dinner with friends. We laughed over candlelight shared stories and toasted to new beginnings. I looked around the table and saw strong women, some married, some single, some divorced, each one powerful in her own way. And I realized I was exactly where I needed to be. I no longer searched for what I lost, because I had found something greater, myself. There is a kind of strength that comes from being broken and choosing to stand anyway. I carried that strength now like armor, and nothing could take it away from me. When I returned home that night, I lit a small candle and sat by the window. The city lights blinked like stars below, and I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Gratitude, not for the pain, but for the lesson, not for the betrayal, but for the rebirth. Andrew was just a chapter. Jessica was just a plot twist. But I was the author, and I was writing my own ending, one filled with peace, with light, with purpose, and no one could steal that from me again. The months that followed felt like a new life blooming after a long winter. I traveled more, not to escape, but to explore, to meet new people, to see new places, to create memories that had nothing to do with pain. I visited small towns and quiet beaches. I read books in cafes and danced under streetlights with strangers who knew nothing about my past. And it was freeing to be unknown, to not be seen as the woman who was cheated on, but simply as Jane, the woman who laughed loudly and walked confidently, the woman who carried no bitterness, only growth. I took pictures of sunsets and saved train tickets in a little notebook, not because I was trying to fill a void, but because I was finally living in the present, not tied to regrets, not waiting for apologies, just breathing each moment in. I started volunteering on weekends, helping women in shelters who had faced betrayal, abuse, abandonment. I listened to their stories held, their hands gave them hope, and in their eyes I saw versions of myself, not weak, not broken, but rising. They reminded me of the night I walked away from my old life with nothing but a suitcase and a shattered heart, and how I built something new from that ruin. They told me I inspired them, but truly, they inspired me. One evening, while speaking at a support group, a woman asked me if I forgave Andrew. The room went quiet, waiting for my answer. I thought for a moment before I replied. Yes, but not for him. For me, forgiveness is not about letting someone back in. It is about letting yourself move forward. I do not hate him, but I will never trust him again. And that is okay, because I do not need his love to be whole. The women in the room nodded, some with tears in their eyes. I realized in that moment that I had become more than I ever dreamed I could be, not in spite of what happened, but because I chose to grow through it. Later that night, I sat on my balcony sipping tea. As the wind rustled the leaves around me, I felt calm, not the forced calm that comes from pretending everything is fine, but the real kind, the kind that comes when you have faced your pain and come out stronger. I thought about the old version of me, the one who boarded that plane to Uruguay, full of hope and love. She was gone, but in her place stood someone better, someone wiser, someone who had learned that real love starts within. I looked up at the stars and whispered a silent thank you to the universe, for the pain, for the strength, for the second chance at life. And as I closed my eyes, I knew this story was no longer about what was taken from me. It was about everything I had found and everything I had become. A year passed since I walked away from the house that once held my dreams. I no longer measured time by what was lost. Instead, I measured it by how much I had grown. I had built a new life from the ground up. It was quiet, simple, but deeply mine. I woke up every morning with peace in my heart. I made my coffee just the way I liked it. I danced around the kitchen to music only I could hear. I smiled at my reflection, not because I needed to prove anything, but because I loved the woman looking back at me. I was no longer searching for revenge. I had already won, not because Andrew suffered, not because Jessica disappeared, but because I found joy without them, because I reclaimed my power, because I stood back up when life knocked me to my knees. One morning while walking through the park, I saw a familiar figure sitting, alone on a bench. It was Andrew. His clothes were worn. His face looked older, tired, heavy. He saw me and stood slowly like he had something to say. But I just gave him a polite nod and kept walking. There was nothing left between us. No anger, no love, just silence. And that silence was powerful. I heard later that he moved again, to another city, trying to start over. Maybe he would find peace one day. But that was no longer my concern. I had my own life to live. A full life, one shaped not by betrayal, but by resilience, not by heartbreak, but by healing. I started writing a book, a memoir about survival and strength. The first chapter was called The Day I Let Go. Each page poured out of me like rain after a storm. It was not just my story. It was the story of every woman who had been betrayed, but chose herself anyway. Of every heart that had been shattered and stitched itself back together. Of every soul that had been dimmed, but never extinguished. The book was picked up by a small publisher, and within months, it spread like fire. Messages flooded in from all over the world. People thanking me for helping them find their own strengths. And in their words, I found another kind of healing. A deeper one. The kind that comes when your pain becomes someone else's hope. One night, I stood on a stage under soft lights at a book signing. A woman in the crowd asked me if I believed in love again. I smiled and said yes, but not the love that depends on someone else. The love that begins within. The love that says, I am enough. I am whole. I am worthy. And if someone wants to walk beside me, they will have to meet me there, at that level of truth and depth. The crowd clapped softly. And in that moment, I knew my journey was not about revenge. It was about rising, not about destroying the ones who hurt me, but about becoming someone they could never break again. As the event ended, I stepped outside into the cool night. The stars above glowed gently, like old friends watching over me. I breathed in deeply and smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because I had made peace with the imperfect.